Welcome to episode 214, Epigenetic Echoes of the Past, addressing intergenerational and historical race-based trauma, featuring Dr. Sonja Sutherland, licensed professional counselor. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical, learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I am so happy to be joined again by Dr. Sonja Sutherland. She is a licensed professional counselor and clinical supervisor in Georgia, and she has joined us previously on some really wonderful and hard-hitting conversations, specifically about race and therapy and also race and supervision. Thank you so much for joining us again, Dr. Sutherland.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So for our listeners who are not yet familiar with you and your work, why don't you take a moment to share a bit and how this became one of your focuses clinically?
I think the work that I've chosen to do around diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice work really stemmed from my initial days in psychiatric residential, where I worked with young people, 13 to 21, most of whom were youth of color. And realizing as I became more aware that I never factored in their spaces of marginalization when I was conceptualizing my work with them. And so at a point later on, I realized that it was because I'd never learned how to do that. I was never taught how to do that, to think about it. I found that same phenomenon being demonstrated in my students and supervisees when I moved into higher ed. And I found that same phenomenon in seasoned clinicians when I do continuing education. So it was important to me to be able to understand for myself what this needed to look like, and then find ways to communicate that or teach that to others, because it's not intuitive. It's not obvious, even though when you hear it, you think it's obvious, but it really is not. Clearly so. There are too many other emotion-laden issues surrounding diversity and marginalization. And we tend to want to push away from those types of things. So we don't naturally include it in our conceptualization in ways that are relevant and helpful for our clients.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today to talk about this topic. As you were speaking about that, it harkened back to me thinking about my first quote unquote cultural diversity class. And that maybe at that point in time, you were getting information about multi-generational family systems living under the same roof, let's say, like these kind of check boxes where it's like, okay, here are some of the norms associated with this group of people or people who practice this religion or whatever it is. And that the more we zoom in on this as a society, appreciating the gravity and how foundational this is. I'm excited for our conversation today and the way that you intend to tie in epigenetics, because the more that I learn about it as a clinician, the more fascinating and, as you said, intuitive it becomes. But for us to only have this knowledge relatively recently and still be kind of at the tip of the iceberg says a lot for what we don't understand about how trauma affects us. So with that in mind, knowing that this is a huge topic and we can obviously only cover so much in a single hour, where would you like to begin today, Dr. Sutherland?
I think a good place to begin is probably why. Trauma is trauma. in most of our eyes. Why is there a need to separate race-based trauma from our regular considerations of trauma? And I think the answer to that is not complicated. Trauma is trauma. However, race-based trauma is typically ignored. It's never a focus. It's not an obvious, we can talk about sexual trauma, we can talk about physical trauma, we can talk about a lot of different things related to trauma. We can talk about self-harming and suicide and all of these things that we're taught about, but we don't talk about race-based trauma. We don't talk about LGBTQ plus trauma. We don't talk about age-related trauma or disability-related trauma. We head nod those things, but we don't talk about them. And these are the types of traumas that are related to qualities that a person has that's obvious about them, right? It's different. While there are many marginalized groups, there are some spaces of marginalization that are hidden. It's not right in front of you. And so the visibility of certain types of realities, characteristics that are connected to the traumas that they experience creates a different dynamic, I think. So we do have to be more specific.
Thank you. I appreciate that. One of the movements in the field in the last 20 years has been more clinical conversation around trauma and its effects. I'm curious your reaction to this whole idea of the big T versus the little t of trauma and pairing out where does race-based trauma fit into this dynamic? Because these are very different things. What we're talking about is an isolated event of sexual violence, let's say, that let's assume was not related to race, is very different than generations of family members and moving forward into the present of experience of both macro or microaggressions. Can you conceptualize that a little bit further so that we can kind of break these down into different categories?
So if I hear your question correctly, you're wanting to understand more clearly what are the lines between what we understand about sexual trauma and how it happens and impacts an individual, or what we understand about physical trauma and how it impacts an individual versus historical intergenerational trauma, adding that into the mix and why that's relevant. It is, in some respects, connected to epigenetics. That's not a conversation that we've started yet, but we can't answer that question without talking about epigenetics and kind of understanding the idea that the research is showing us that the memories, the traumatic memories of generations before are written into the cells, into our DNA, such that some research has showed us that children of and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Holocaust survivors dream some of the dreams of their ancestors, and that depression, anxiety is influenced by the trauma that they didn't experience, but the trauma that was experienced by their community. And that type of cellular-based connection is important to really think about when we then talk about historical trauma as well as intergenerational community traumas. that is a contextual difference when we're talking about sexual trauma, even when there are generations of sexual trauma in a family, because we still don't, in that situation, have the context of a community-wide trauma, right? So that context is different, and so we have to consider it differently.
You and I have already mentioned the word epigenetics a couple of times. For listeners who are either not familiar with it or only having have a passing familiarity, can you give us a quick primer on what epigenetics even is?
A quick primer on epigenetics.
And go.
And go. So, epigenetics tells us that trauma can be transmitted to children, and that transmission can continue beyond the next generation, the second generation, and include grandkids, great grandkids. And it is a phenomenon that exists in such a way that it's as if they have actually inherited the unconscious minds of their parents, and for or grandparents, right? And so the formal definition of epigenetics, by Kellerman, I think, is that it's the study of changes, inheritable changes in gene expression, right, that occurs as a result of environmental stress or major emotional trauma, and it leaves like markers on the chemical coding of our chromosomes. So it's very well researched, and it is providing a new context for us for understanding trauma. When we think about the types of traumas that we could talk about, we're talking about Holocaust survivors. We're talking about war veterans. We're talking about refugees, torture victims, community, larger traumas with specific to a community of people that then becomes written into their cellular spaces. So I think it's important to understand then that we can't exclude from our clinical conceptualization that the events of 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 150 years ago are playing out in the emotional and behavioral and relational and socioeconomic status, etc., presentations of our clients of color today. And we're talking about that manifestation of both historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, and they're different. And so there is that clarification as well that is going to be important to understand. They're different and both influential.
That was a very good primer on what epigenetics is. So thank you for that. In digging into it a little bit more, if you're looking at it through the lens of evolutionary psychology, it makes a lot of sense. And not just applied to trauma, but just this idea that my genes are changing real time in response to access to certain foods. One of the ones that I read that blew my mind was that there are genetic changes among people with internal reproductive organs that make it more or less likely to have future C-sections, which is fascinating to me. So because I came from women who had prior had C-sections, that made it more likely for me to have one because there were structural changes in my genetic code. That's mind-blowing to me. But this idea that any person's genes are changing real time in the environment and then also going to alter what's handed down to subsequent generations. To me, it kind of brings together genetic science and a genogram. And I think that perspective that you're sharing makes so much sense when you're saying, yes, there's a person in front of you, but then there are hundreds of years of history that have been changing this person's genes to lead to the person that's sitting in front of you. So then splitting out, as you said, intergenerational and historical, can you speak about that and how you're separating them?
Sure. So historical trauma is trauma that is specific to a group of people, identifiable by a similar trait that they have, a religious group, and a racial group, a nationality, an ethnic group. So there is this intent to destroy that group by killing members of the group or causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group, or deliberately inflicting certain conditions of life or experiences of life that are calculated to bring about that group's destruction, whether wholly or in part, physically, emotionally, imposing, for example, measures that can prevent births within a group, or transferring children of one group to another group and separating them. So when the United Nations years ago talked about this, they really spoke to all of these types of things around historical trauma and the impact that it has. When we're talking about intergenerational trauma that's related to historical trauma, we're talking about, in many cases, that psychological or physical or spiritual aftermath that can be carried into subsequent generations, whether those events are known or not among the subsequent generations. So here's an example. The separation of Native American children from their parents and their transfer or forced movement to boarding schools that took them outside of their culture for long periods of time. That's an example of a historical event that was meant to destroy a culture, destroy a way of life. And those historical traumas, or that historical trauma, leads us to intergenerational trauma. So now we're talking about the psychological aftermath, the physical aftermath, the spiritual aftermath that then walks its way through all of these different generations afterward. Is that clear?
Yes, and I have a follow-up question.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to have historical trauma without having intergenerational trauma?
Yes. So you can have historical traumas like an earthquake that affected a large group of people, but it wasn't targeted. It wasn't targeted. It was a natural disaster. right? And so the difference that we're making is that we're not talking about larger traumas that are just a part of what will happen in our world. We're talking about traumas that are connected to intentional efforts by one group to impact another.
Okay. Thank you. And would someone's potential experience of intergenerational trauma in response to a historical trauma be kind of highly individual for that family system? So I'm thinking about the example of an earthquake that if my family was in the community where there was an earthquake, but there weren't as many, let's say, direct losses, could it be dictated that it's different for somebody else and potential intergenerational trauma because of their lived experience, that if now a generation and subsequent generations are going to be forever different because of an injury that resulted that changed somebody's ability to caregive, let's say?
A perfect example of that is Katrina. Katrina impacted one group of people much more significantly than it impacted another group of people. And so we're talking about those living in poverty in certain areas in New Orleans. And so that concentrated group of people that were in a certain socioeconomic bracket, that lived in certain areas, that had common racial background, they were impacted much more significantly because of the lack of infrastructure that would protect them, right? And the losses they experienced as a result were significantly greater and more impactful. And the ability to recover from that was different because of lack of resources, personal resources, as well as community resources and statewide availability of resources, federal resources that were afforded to them. Very different from other groups of people who socioeconomically were impacted, but there's a wealth gap, so that their personal ability to recover looks different. It takes a different amount of time, for example, and the impact is different. So that's just one example of Katrina being a historical trauma that impacted a large group of people across groups, but impacted certain groups based on race or socioeconomic status in much more significant ways, that then we will see epigenetically those types of things showing up differently generations down the line.
Thank you. I think that was a perfect example to illustrate that phenomenon. I remember at some point in time, probably back in school, going back to this idea of a genogram, this idea that many patterns within families would subsist for any number of generations. The number that's coming to mind for me was 6 to 8, and I cannot remember the research that said that, and it may be me misremembering. So I want to say that for our listeners. But this idea that almost that there's this timestamp, looking at it through the lens of a genogram, which is not genetics. How do you feel about this idea of there being a timestamp to historical and intergenerational traumas in terms of when has enough time for something, when is enough time passed that there's a potential for the genetic and emotional trauma to fall away, or do we have no idea, or that it doesn't happen at all?
I have no idea. I don't, and I won't pretend. I haven't done the research, and I haven't actually read research around that in particular. It's an interesting question, certainly, but I do think that the answer to something like that is much more difficult to come to because there's so many other factors that are impacting that. So it's not occurring in a vacuum. And so we can't I don't see how to timestamp it.
How could you possibly link those nightmares to that thing that happened 246 years ago?
Well, not only that, in the 246 years, it's not only that thing that happened 246 years ago. There's so many other things that have happened as well. And the course of social history, not just environmental history, for example, or right, political history, social history, all of that impacts some of that, how long it may take. I kind of equate it to how long should it take a divorced woman with children to recover financially from the phenomenon of divorce where wealth was not part of the equation? Well, 10 years, 15 years, 5 years, 20 years? You can't really say because there's so many other things that are impinging, right? And it can take 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. It really just depends. The other thing to think about is I think about some of the things that are happening right now in our society, just around race and history and removal of history from schools, removal from certain books related to certain types of history from schools. There are political movements and legislature and things that we can't anticipate necessarily that throw wrenches in the answers to the questions. How long would it take? What would the timestamp be, right? Who would have predicted a backward march, right, around education when it comes to slavery and the history of Black people in America? So it's just too difficult, I think. Now, someone smarter than me may have a different idea and know how to do that, but I don't. I can't see it.
They're interesting thoughts to play with. Going back to what you said about targeting toward certain ethnic groups, for example, or toward nationalities, toward certain races.
Or towards people with certain sexual orientations.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting to think about too, because I'm also considering the element of phenotype here. So knowing that the word that's been used for a while now in the United States is the quote unquote gradual browning of America, as there's more and more multi-ethnic, multiracial identity, that we're getting as a society muddier with the phenotype. That it's like, well, someone could be much more white passing, for example, but still be 75% Black, let's say. And this interesting idea that someone could have a lived experience of passing in America as white or passing as straight, whatever these passing as not having a disability. I mean, that's another one for sure. But then particularly if this is something that's gone on for multiple generations within that family line, looking back that they could effectively perhaps have an absence or a perceived absence of real-time trauma related to that characteristic, but still have the intergenerational trauma piece that's in their genetic code.
I would say that differently. They may have the intergenerational trauma that's coded in, but they will have a different experience of trauma based on being white passing. There are the level of dissonance that can be experienced by white passing individuals who consider themselves Black, or white passing individuals who consider themselves Hispanic, or whatever it would be. There is this dissonance that occurs within them related to who am I and where do I fit? Am I guilty of anything if I white pass? Am I rejecting my heritage if I pass? If I accept the advantages or the privileges that might come in certain situations with passing? How do I reconcile that with myself, within myself, knowing that my family is Black and there are people in my family who don't look like me, who have a completely different experience of the world?
I sincerely appreciate the reframe that you just did, which leads me to, I guess, another question or more an observation. Then we are not necessarily categorizing, but we're identifying perhaps different shades of trauma. So that if you have the white passing person, yes, they're probably less likely to experience overt racism than someone who's not. And yet, that dissonance caused by, I'm trying to think how to phrase it. There's this thing about me that I know that other people might not. And it's confusing to me about how I interact in the world. And I'm saying that as a queer woman in a straight marriage who has the benefit of appearing straight because of that affiliation, and also the parent of multiracial children, where I have one child who is much more white passing than the other, and the awareness of this. And I don't know if I personally, as a parent, have put it under the category of trauma as much as the awareness of that dissonance of just, wow, this is really confusing because phenotypically they're different. One of my children looks much more like me, the other does not. And then when we go to the doctor, and then it's like, well, you know, what is their race? What's their ethnicity? And it's like, well, let me get out the list for you. And that this is relevant to their medical histories about what are they more likely to experience, because there is some Egyptian in there, because there is some sub-Saharan South African. Like there are all these different ideas that are coming into play. And I think it's, these are potentially really complicated to keep in mind as a clinician, because there's the person that's in front of you. And then there is like this invisible timeline, potentially invisible timeline behind them, around them, sitting with them on the couch, knowing what you know, doing what you do, working particularly in the realm of race-based trauma and this idea of epigenetics and multi-generational trauma, or intergenerational trauma and historical trauma. How do you bring that into the room with clients, and how do you bring that into the room with supervisees so that this becomes mainstream?
It's not easy. One of the reasons it's not easy is because sometimes we don't have access to certain family history. They don't have it, they don't know it. Some things were repressed or just not talked about in families because of the traumas related, and other reasons as well. And so one of the important pieces really is being able to trace back to a degree some of the origins and experiences of your ancestors. Some that are on a larger scale, on a wider scale, you might know, but you might never know the reactions of some of your ancestors. You may never know which of the traumas they may have lived through historically. And so it's difficult to bring it into the room when that's not there. One of the things that's super helpful is being able to do a complete, as much as we can, just a genogram that is both intergenerational but also historically informed. Informed by the social and political events of the time. So even though we may not necessarily be able to get our clients, have clients who can always say, this is what my grandmother experienced, this is what my great-grandmother experienced, what we can do is have an understanding of the periods of time in which they lived and what were the community-wide or historical traumas that were occurring at that time, and how might those traumas have likely impacted someone in my family who looked like me. And so you can surmise to a degree, but that's all you can do is surmise when there's an absence of actual information and connection that your client has to their history.
So let's say that we have a client and we're able to do that, that we have enough information from past generations, we're able to, whether it's look these things up from genetic testing or go back to talk to great grandparents so and so and get more information. If we have this information and we create the genogram and integrate it and say, well, this was happening in Los Angeles when your dad was growing up a few blocks away, let's say. Are we after increasing insight? Is it just clinically, and it's probably a lot of things, but so is it making space for, hey, have you ever considered that why you responded that way to that thing that happened at work? Maybe because something similar has been happening in your family for a really long time.
Yes. And more importantly, what we're after is resilience, because the reality is that victims of race-based trauma, victims of LGBTQ related trauma, victims of disability related traumas, these events aren't random. They're targeted. They're not random in that it's connected to who they seem to be, right? And they don't have control over that to a degree. There is also just this systemically embedded response, I think, to these types of incidents that's wrapped up in like victim blaming, victim attribution, right? And that's the context in which an individual has to make sense of what's occurring for them. And so these are repetitive things that happen. And so that's why I say resilience, because it's not as though the trauma happened and it's not happening anymore and you're recovering from it or learning how to operate in the world. It is that those traumas for you and for your generations of families have been repeated things that have happened throughout life that have always been based on visually what it is that you appear to be. So what question were we answering?
When we bring it into the room. So if we do that multi-generational genogram and can bring in kind of the social framework, let's say, around prior generations, are we after insight? Are we after just acknowledgement? Because I feel like there's so much here about it. This is too trite a word, but psychoeducation, to say, hey, did you know that thing that happened, in the 40s, in the 1940s, not only is that part of your family story and why you have this tradition to do a certain food on a certain day of the year, let's say, but this also likely changed your literal genetic code that you inherited. When you do it, what are you after?
Several things. Normalization is one of their reaction to the experience, validation of their reaction to the experience. Some of it is going to be acknowledging. Some of it is psychoeducation. It just is part of what may be necessary so that someone can say, oh, it's not just me, or, oh, this is why this makes sense, or, oh, I'm not crazy. I'm not seeing things. I'm not being oversensitive, right? That's the goal of some of the psychoeducation, to allow them to acknowledge, okay, yes, this is what happened to me. And this is what happened to generations of people in my family. And all of that is showing up in my reactions.
Thank you. As you were saying that, you nearly said it, which reminded me of the book "It Didn't Start with You" by Mark Wolin, because I think there is something potentially really freeing there. We live in a highly individualistic society that wants to say, and has a habit of saying, well, you did the thing. That's on you. Whatever that is. And it's not necessarily, I think, trying to distribute blame. I don't think that's what it's about. But I'm thinking for a client who's sitting there going like, why does this keep happening? Why when that happens, do I go straight into panic and I have a panic attack and I can't stop it? And it's like, why is that particular trigger that happens there and I can't stop it? There seems something potentially really clinically soothing for someone to come in and say, well, here's one of the reasons that it might be really hard for you to stop doing that thing, or why that thing that you do is actually super protective when you dissociate or when you have that panic attack and you excuse yourself from that circumstance. To me, that's just piggybacking on what you already said about kind of normalization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I love the title of that book, It Didn't Start With You. It's the phrase just in itself is such a freeing phrase, lifts a little bit of a weight, because now it's like, okay, so maybe there's some hope and I can start someplace. I think a lot of times what we do in our work, clinical work, is we, depending on our theoretical orientation, we're going back primarily to, well, what happened in your childhood that can explain what you do right now? And yes, there is that. But as we've been talking about, there's so much more than that as well. And so really being able to acknowledge and understand a lot of that is going to be your first, one of the most important things to think about. Another thing I think that is important to know when we're working with these phenomenons in our room is that there is a level of safety that these individuals won't feel. And it makes sense that they don't feel it. And so part of our work is allowing space for them to acknowledge and we validate the fact that your safety has been compromised. It's not a mirage. It's not. It is there, and it happens multiple times throughout your life, sometimes on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis. Either your psychological safety is at risk or your physical safety is at risk, right? Because sometimes it's not always a physical incident, right? Sometimes it's the reality of microaggressions and the impact of microaggressions that occur on a daily basis. So that lack of feeling safe, acknowledging it, but also what do we do about it? How do we build your resilience so that you can feel a level of safety in your ability to respond to what happens to you in a way that is empowering for you as opposed to victimizing for you.
These incidents, as you said, microaggressions, are, I think, often destabilizing and confusing of like, why is this getting to me so much? Why have I not been able to sleep for 3 days now? And I toss and turn and I have no appetite or whatever it is. And like, the only thing I can tie it to was that comment that was made when I was at the grocery store. I think even just that acknowledgement that either your lived history or your generational history has gotten pushed up to the forefront. What kind of language are you using when you talk about this with clients? When you've made that link and it's like, I think what's happening over here is related to that thing that happened back there. What do you say? And then where do you go from there once you've kind of identified it?
I conceptualize it as grief and the mourning of the loss of something. And it can be the mourning of your loss of trust in the world. It can be the mourning or grieving the loss of power and control. It can be grieving, it's that disillusionment. I really thought the world could be this, and it's not. What does that mean for me? What does that mean for my children? And what do I do about that? Right. So to me, there's a level of grief that has to be explored related to those things. When you say it, it reminds me of when my mother passed away years ago. I couldn't sleep for a while. I remember being up at 3, 4 in the morning, and my mind just can't rest. Uh, and ending up calling people that at 3 in the morning that I happen to know would have been up anyway, but I didn't wake anybody up. But I couldn't sleep. I was like, why can't I sleep? I'm tired. What's the matter? Why can't I sleep? It was part of my grieving.
I think you just went somewhere that I want to follow, and thank you for sharing about that. From an intervention standpoint, is that one of the potential antidotes is connection? That I know for me, when I've had those moments of whatever I'm going through was something that this family member went through before me, and it's like I call it pulling up from the well. It's like you have some seaweed that's gotten churned up and it's right at the top now. It seems to me that it can be helpful to connect with other people, either around that exact thing where it's like, okay, yes, you've experienced this too as a result of this upbringing or as a result of growing up looking this way in this society or whatever it is. Or even just the idea of right now I feel really separate from, and I need to figure out how to bring myself back into a sense of community. Is that an intervention that you reach for with these clients when they're realizing like, oh yeah, all of that stuff has now come up real time? And then there's this potentially kind of frantic, what the hell do I do with it? This is awful. This feels awful. Make it go away.
Yeah, connection is one thing. It's not the only thing, though. I think connection is helpful for mediating self-blame, shame, those types of things, aloneness, esteem, things like that. However, it gives a sense of belonging that everybody needs, right? Beyond that, though, it has to be coupled with some type of resistance strategy. So it has to be coupled with, yes, I'm not alone, and here's what I'm going to choose to do. Now, what I choose to do doesn't mean that I'm going to be protected from experiencing these things again. No. However, I'm empowered because I'm choosing to do something to fight back. For example, voting, advocacy, right? Petitions, whatever it would be. Something that you want to do in hopes that it will make a difference. That taking back of some power and control is part of the resilience building and even part of the healing, the way to deal with the grief that you experience, the hopelessness that might come along with that, and doing it in concert with other people who are of the same mind and who are also striving. So connection, yes, and taking back power through resistance strategies. And, along the way, obviously, you have to work on the coping skills that they're going to need to deal with the emotions that always come up when you're facing a racist-based incident, when there's stress injury that's coming from a race-based incident, whether it is a physical assault that potentially moves you into the realm of PTSD, maybe, or microaggressions that lead to things like racial battle fatigue and secondary traumatic stress and things like that. So it's both and.
Thank you. I appreciate the example you gave there about resistance strategies because there's the acknowledgement that trying to take back power doesn't necessarily need to, nor should it occur with a person or group who took the power away from you. And that one seemed, potentially can unfold in a pretty obvious way, which is going toe to toe with your in-laws, may not be advisable, may not be safe, but how do you still get that need met of feeling like you're doing something? There's something you can do to acknowledge the pain that this has caused you and other people like you. Because I can see the potential clinical danger there, which is like, well, you need to go tell human resources. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. You're shaking your head. Can you speak more on that?
Yeah, we want to be careful as clinicians not to take autonomy away from them, from our clients. Some of that has already happened, so it can happen with us as well. Certainly, there are times when your client may want to engage in brainstorming around what could I do in real time. That could, if we let's just use your example, result in their choice to go to human resources or their choice to find a different position or not, or other choices or options. But it has to be it has to be what they decide to come up with. And I hesitate to make suggestions because what each person needs is going to be different. And I don't have all the answers. I'm not supposed to have all the answers anyway, right? They have to figure out what will work for their lives. The other piece to think about too is we talked about the need for understanding and if possible, hearing from relatives, prior generations, just about the experiences that are informing the trauma throughout the years. When we work with an individual on their personal trauma, and I'm doing personal in quotes, we have to remember too that they still will exist within a certain family dynamic, potentially, right? And that family dynamic is going to have an impact on how well they're able to walk through their trauma. When we have the opportunity to bring family into this type of work, I think it can be extremely effective and helpful to do so, because we're still talking about systems work, really. We are, regardless of what is occurring in the moment with the client in terms of incidents, we're still thinking through the intergenerational trauma, the epigenetics piece, the historical contexts, all of those things that have impacted the whole family. And so there's potential for healing for an entire family if we're able to access multiple generations. Most of the time we can't, unfortunately.
It's an interesting thing you just brought up too, because there's the healing that could go back in time, back to older generations, but then there's also the healing that could be occurring moving forward. And that idea of being the one, so to speak, that tries to understand and potentially break those patterns, whatever they may be, whether it's infidelity, incest, these things are not, none of these are simple occurrences. They're complex. But this idea that, well, maybe there isn't so much I can do for my parents or for my grandparents or my aunts and uncle or whatever, but I can try to change this and increase my awareness for my niece. And that opens up a whole nother idea of epigenetics and changing in a good way. Right? It does. Going back to what you said about resilience, where it's like, oh, well, look at that. So if we could have things change and a trauma response develop over generations, what if our response and hopefully society around us, get really lofty here, but if society around us could accommodate and adjust so that that response can dissipate over time instead of it become more and more hardened and necessary for survival.
Right. And that's the difficult piece. That's where we get to differentiating between working with sexual trauma, for example, and race-based trauma. Because again, I'm going to say this and then I'm going to contradict myself, because we don't have control over where the society will go. We do, to a degree, through advocacy, but we can't predict and we don't have total control. And so the ongoing daily traumas, weekly traumas, that may not exist for a sexual abuse survivor or an incest abuse survivor, create that other dynamic that makes it so much more difficult when we're talking about race-based trauma, LGBTQ-based trauma, things like that.
I don't want our hour to end, Sonja. I want to keep talking about
There's
this.
always just so much more to talk about. We never, can get to the end of it because the questions and the answers bring more questions, right? And so, I think that it's easy for folks of color who have not experienced overt racism to forget that what we see and hear on television and on the internet and in media does impact us from a secondary stress perspective related to race. An example is how I felt when all of the changes that were happening in Florida were occurring and being validated legislatively. The trauma that I experienced, I don't live in Florida, but the trauma that I experienced secondarily was what all of a sudden we don't matter and our history doesn't matter. There was a pit in my stomach that said, wait, what, right? When the legislation came down in Florida that in schools, you can't say gay and you can't talk about sexual orientation differences and you can't acknowledge those realities. There's a pit in my stomach. Well, but I don't matter anymore. That is trauma. And our solutions often are to numb ourselves out of feeling the experience because it's painful. It hurts. And then when you hear about it over and over and over again, that's trauma. And we don't realize that we're numbing ourselves to deal with that. Well, that doesn't impact me. Dig a little deeper. And we do it because we have to go on with our lives in some reasonable fashion. We can't stop living.
Yeah, it becomes suffocating otherwise.
It becomes suffocating otherwise. Yeah.
It becomes so big that I think it's easy to understand why we would want to distance, why we would want to numb. I am so grateful to you for going here, not just for the podcast, but thank you for going here with me as a human and as a clinician. For people who are listening that want to know more about what you've talked about today, what are your favorite resources?
I don't know that I have a list of resources around this. The training that I offer, the 6-hour training that I offer around this, incorporates lots of resources, but I can't really think of what I could say they would be in terms of books or things like that. Part of it is because a lot of this is not that well researched.
I'm thinking about how we already mentioned the book, It Didn't Start With You. In your learning about epigenetics and trauma and mental health care, where are you getting that information from? Like, is there a particular resource that you feel like is the most valid or reliable?
It is primarily from different articles from different researchers. And there's not a lot. Kellerman, Bryant Davis, and Ocampo did some work on this.
Dr. Sutherland, for our listeners that specifically want to learn more about you and about your work, what's the best way to do that?
So for more information, you can go to legacychangerstraining.com for a list of different trainings and resources that we have available. To know more about me personally, you can go to drsonjasutherland.com. There are lots of resources there as well.
Thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for having these hard conversations and for giving us all clinically a bit of pause to recognize not just the person or their phenotype sitting in front of us, but this whole story of a history of how they became who they are today.
I appreciate your focusing on it. There's not enough focus on it. So I absolutely value the work that you do in bringing this to our community, our clinical community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sutherland.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our 1-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.